Every seed oil explained. Few things in the grocery store have started more arguments at dinner parties than a bottle of vegetable oil. A few years ago, seed oils were just background noise, the stuff you poured into a pan without a second thought. Now, they've somehow become one of the most contested topics in nutrition, with one camp insisting they're quietly poisoning modern civilization and another camp pointing at decades of research showing the opposite. Here's the thing, more people should just admit. The truth is a lot less dramatic and a lot more interesting than either side's headline. And most of these oils have a genuinely fascinating industrial origin story that has almost nothing to do with the health debate everyone's currently having about them. Let's get into it. Soybean oil. Soybean oil is, in a very real sense, the default seed oil in America, showing up in more packaged food than almost any other ingredient on this list, largely because it's a byproduct of an industry that exists primarily to make animal feed and protein meal. Soybeans are only about 18 to 20% oil by weight, so the oil is technically the secondary product of pressing soybeans for the much larger soy meal market, which is exactly why soybean oil became so cheap and so common. The beans were already being processed at massive scale for another reason entirely. It's high in polyunsaturated fat, specifically the omega-6 fatty acid linoleic acid. And it's this exact fatty acid that sits at the center of most of the seed oil health debate. More on that in a minute. Canola oil. Canola is one of the stranger names in the grocery store, since it's not actually a naturally occurring plant. It's a trademarked name for a specially bred, low-toxicity version of rapeseed developed by Canadian scientists in the 1970s. The name itself is a shortened combination of Canadian oil, low acid, created specifically to distance the new product from rapeseed's original industrial reputation, since standard rapeseed oil contains high levels of erucic acid, a compound linked to heart tissue damage in early animal studies, along with a bitter compound that made it unpleasant to eat in large quantities. Canola was bred to strip both of those problems out almost entirely, and it's now one of the lowest saturated fat oils on the market, with a genuinely mild flavor and a high smoke point that made it popular for frying almost immediately after its introduction. Corn oil. Corn oil is extracted from the germ of the corn kernel, a tiny fraction of the total kernel by weight, which means producing corn oil at scale really only became commercially practical once industrial corn processing for starch and sweeteners was already happening on a massive level, with the oil showing up as a profitable side stream rather than the main event. It carries a notably high smoke point, well above 400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is exactly why it became a favorite for deep frying. And it was actually one of the very first vegetable oils marketed directly to American households, with Mazola launching in 1911 specifically as a lard alternative during a period when doctors were beginning to raise concerns about animal fat. Sunflower oil. Sunflower oil comes in a few genuinely different varieties depending on how the plant was bred, which matters more than people realize. Standard sunflower oil is high in polyunsaturated linoleic acid, similar to soybean oil, while high oleic sunflower oil, developed through selective breeding starting in the 1980s, is instead dominated by monounsaturated fat, chemically closer to olive oil than to a typical seed oil. That distinction actually changes the oil's stability under heat considerably, since monounsaturated fats resist oxidative breakdown better than polyunsaturated ones, which is why high oleic sunflower oil has become a popular choice specifically for potato chip and snack food frying, where a longer shelf life matters commercially. Safflower oil. Safflower oil, pressed from the seeds of a thistle-like flowering plant that's actually one of humanity's oldest cultivated crops, with evidence of its use in ancient Egypt for dye rather than food, exists in the same two-variety split as sunflower oil, with a high linoleic version and a high oleic version bred for different purposes. The high oleic version is prized in the cosmetic and skincare industry almost as much as the kitchen, since its stable fatty acid profile makes it a common carrier oil in lotions and serums, meaning there's a decent chance safflower oil is sitting in your bathroom cabinet, even if it's never touched your stovetop. Cottonseed oil. Cottonseed oil has one of the odder origin stories on this list. Since it started out purely as an industrial waste product from cotton farming, considered essentially useless and occasionally even toxic in its raw form, thanks to a naturally occurring compound called gossypol that has to be removed through refining before the oil is safe to eat. 19th century American processors eventually figured out how to refine it into an edible product, and cottonseed oil became the base for Crisco when Procter & Gamble launched it in 1911. Marketed as a cheaper, longer-lasting alternative to lard and butter, using an early industrial hydrogenation process that, decades later, would become notorious for producing trans fats. Grapeseed oil. Grapeseed oil is another byproduct success story, made from the seeds left over after winemaking, a source that was historically discarded entirely until oil extraction technology improved enough in the 20th century to make pressing those tiny seeds commercially worthwhile. It carries a light, neutral flavor and a fairly high smoke point, and it's become a favorite in beauty products for a similar reason to safflower oil, since it absorbs into skin quickly without leaving a heavy residue. Rice bran oil. Rice bran oil is pressed from the outer bran layer of rice, the same nutrient-dense layer that gets polished away to make white rice, and it's particularly popular across Japan and Southeast Asia. It contains a naturally occurring compound called oryzanol, a plant compound found specifically in rice bran that's been studied for potential cholesterol-related benefits, and it holds up unusually well under high heat, which is part of why it's a favorite for tempura frying in Japanese kitchens. Peanut oil and sesame oil. Technically, peanuts are legumes rather than true seeds, but peanut oil earns its spot on any seed oil list anyway, thanks to its high smoke point and mild flavor, which made it the traditional choice for southern fried chicken, and is why it's still the go-to for deep frying an entire turkey. Sesame oil splits into two genuinely different products, depending on processing. Light sesame oil, pressed from raw seeds, has a mild flavor and high smoke point suited to actual cooking, while toasted sesame oil, pressed from roasted seeds, is intensely aromatic and used almost exclusively as a finishing oil in small amounts, since its low smoke point and powerful flavor make it a terrible choice for frying anything. Now, the part everyone actually came here for. The core of the seed oil health debate comes down almost entirely to one fatty acid, linoleic acid, an omega-6 polyunsaturated fat found at high concentrations in soybean, corn, sunflower, and cottonseed oil in particular. The concern, popularized heavily in recent years by wellness influencers, certain carnivore and paleo diet communities, and public figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., centers on the idea that a dramatic rise in omega-6 consumption relative to omega-3 consumption over the past century has shifted the body toward a more pro-inflammatory state, since the two fatty acid families compete for some of the same metabolic pathways. That theory has real biochemical logic behind it. And it's genuinely true that the average American omega-6 to omega-3 ratio has climbed considerably as seed oil consumption rose through the 20th century. Where things get murkier is what that shift actually does to a person's health in practice. Large human studies, including a substantial body of research reviewed by the American Heart Association, have generally found that replacing saturated fat with linoleic acid-rich seed oils is associated with lower LDL cholesterol and a reduced risk of cardiovascular events, the opposite direction of what the inflammation theory alone would predict. Randomized controlled trials specifically measuring inflammatory blood markers after increased linoleic acid intake have also mostly failed to find the dramatic inflammatory spike the theory suggests, which is a genuinely awkward result for the more alarmist version of the seed oil argument. Mainstream nutrition science, for now, still generally treats moderate seed oil consumption as heart-neutral to heart-protective, particularly when it's replacing saturated fat rather than being added on top of an already high-fat diet. That said, the skeptics aren't working from nothing, and a fair accounting has to include their strongest points, too. Most commercial seed oil extraction relies on a solvent called hexane to maximize yield from the seed. And while the finished oil is refined and tested to remove hexane residue to trace levels considered safe by regulators, critics reasonably point out that this is a genuinely industrial process, a world away from something like cold-pressed olive oil. There's also a real, well-established concern around how these oils behave at high heat over repeated use, since polyunsaturated fats are chemically more prone to oxidation than saturated or monounsaturated fats, and reused overheated frying oil does measurably break down into potentially harmful oxidation byproducts, a legitimate food safety issue independent of the broader inflammation debate. And to be fair to the skeptics one more time, a lot of the foods seed oils show up in fried snacks, packaged baked goods, fast food, aren't exactly health foods to begin with. So it's genuinely difficult to isolate the oil itself from the ultra-processed company it usually keeps. So where does that leave you standing in the grocery aisle? Somewhere reasonably boring, honestly. An occasional deep-fried something cooked in soybean oil is not the dietary equivalent of a horror movie villain, but reusing the same frying oil for the fourth time because it still looks fine is a genuinely worse idea than the oil's fatty acid profile alone. The type of oil matters less than most headlines suggest, and how it's used, how many times it's been reheated, and what else is on the plate probably matters more. At the end of the day, seed oils cover an almost absurd amount of ground for products that mostly started as someone's leftover industrial byproduct looking for a second job. A bottle of high oleic sunflower oil bred specifically to resist oxidation, and a jug of soybean oil that only exists because someone needed the beans for cattle feed are, in their own strange way, both products of the same 20th century push to squeeze value out of every part of a crop. That's really the through line connecting everything here, from cottonseed oil's unlikely rebrand as Crisco, to grapeseed oil rescuing something wineries used to just throw away. Every single oil on this list ended up in your kitchen through some mix of industrial necessity, clever chemistry, and a whole lot of 20th century marketing. Whether that meant taming rapeseed into something Canada could put its name on, or figuring out how to make cotton waste edible. Whether it's a bottle of plain vegetable oil, grabbed without a second thought, or a bottle of toasted sesame oil used 2 drops at a time like it's expensive perfume. Seed oils offer both ends of that spectrum just as well as tea, potatoes, rice, and mushrooms do. People who go out of their way to actually read the debate instead of just picking a side on the internet tend to notice something interesting. The world got a lot more complicated and a lot less villain and hero shaped, one bottle at a time.